Hey there, intelligent automation community. Welcome back to the second part in my little series on RPA in the cloud.
Cloud.
In part one, I covered the three scenarios where you may deploy RPA on your cloud provider of choice. If you haven't seen part one, I'd probably pause this video and go and check that out so you have the full context. In part two, this video, I'm going to cover the architectural differences between Automation Anywhere's A2019 Cloud, UiPath's Automation Cloud, and Blue Prism Cloud. And to do this, I need to cover how RPA architecture and network traffic between the various different components works in general across any RPA platform. Last time I mentioned that I was going to do two videos in this little series, but the video today gets a little bit dense, a little bit technical, and it's on the longer side. So I'm going to split the robotics as a service topic into a third and final video. Fortunately, you're in luck because I'll be joined by my friend Johnny Ramondino, who is the president of Invoke, a robotics as a service provider. Also, before I get into this video, I think it's really important to note that I work for Blue Prism, and that is obviously going to influence some bias on my point of view on these topics. However, none of these videos are produced, written, or censored by Blue Prism. They're my point of view on these various different topics, and they don't necessarily reflect the company Blue Prism's point of view on any specific topic. I make these for fun and to hopefully expand your education in the intelligent automation space. Although, probably wouldn't hold it against you if you wanted to buy a few more Blue Prism digital workers either. Okay, so with disclaimers out of the way, last time I covered how you can offload the data center aspects of your RPA deployment to a cloud service provider such as AWS or Azure. But in those scenarios, you're still managing most of the RPA platform health. What if you want to offload everything about managing the RPA platform and just focus on building and running automations? If you flip through marketing from UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism, you'll notice that all three offer their own spin on a cloud platform, which would probably lead you to believe that everything I covered in the first video about cloud platforms is completely irrelevant. I mean, why would you work with a cloud platform provider and an RPA vendor separately where you can just get it all in one place and have the RPA vendor manage everything for you? Well, with Blue Prism Cloud, you can do exactly that. When you buy BP Cloud, the team sets up and hosts all the architecture components, communication pathways, software, and licensing for you. They also manage and update the platform, so you're just left building and running automations. Blue Prism Cloud also includes a suite of cognitive capabilities that go way beyond what's packaged with the standard traditional Blue Prism enterprise offering. But this video is specifically focused on architecture. The UiPath Automation Cloud and Automation Anywhere A2019 Cloud offerings are completely different than this in that they're not fully managed solutions. The most critical difference is that Automation Anywhere and UiPath do not host the robot VMs or virtual desktops, which is the majority of the infrastructure required for RPA to operate. Both RPA vendors host the orchestrator, the license server, the process models, and the bits related to this. They do not host the architecture that actually performs the software robot work. They also only retain logs for 30 days, so you're still going to need to set up and manage all the hardware for your digital workers, and realistically, any company that's doing anything at any level of scale is going to need to retain logs for more than 30 days, so you're going to need to set up a database as well. Now, I usually don't use slideware for these videos, but this is just a much easier concept to visualize. So why don't we do this? We're going to spin around to the computer and check out a bit more about what I have on the screen behind me. All right, up for a little different view at this point. So you're probably going to care a little bit more about the slideware than you're going to care about seeing me chatter at this point. So why don't we do this? We're going to make this screen a little bit smaller. And let's make these quite a bit bigger. All right, good? Okay, so RPA platforms generally have three major infrastructure components that you're going to care about. Each one of the vendors is going to call this something slightly different, although I don't know if there's a different word for database, but the other components they might call something slightly different. But it comes down to three major pieces of infrastructure. Okay, so first off, you have your runtime resources, or the virtual machines, the virtual desktops where the robots are living and performing their work. Keep in mind that RPA software robots are typically interacting with business applications through the same user interfaces as your human users. Consequently, just like a human employee, these RPA digital workers need a workstation, which is typically a Windows operating system. Next, you have your application servers, which host the control and orchestration components of the RPA platform. These application servers marshal the traffic between the robot machines and the database. They tell the digital workers what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and what credentials to use. They're typically also constantly pinging both the digital workers to make sure that they're online, and then collecting logs back from the digital workers, and then storing those logs over in the database, which of course brings us to our last component, which is we need to have a database to store process instructions, store system logs for anything that's changed in the platform over time, and then also the logs of what your software robots are doing. Depending on your RPA platform and the level of process logging that you've enabled, there can be a high volume of real-time communication flowing between the various different parts of this infrastructure. Generally, the data packets are very, very small, but there can be a ton of movement going across the wire. So when RPA vendors market their cloud solution, what are they actually providing in terms of hosting and architecture? Well, with Blue Prism Cloud, all of these components are in the same data center managed for you. Blue Prism Cloud hosts the robot virtual desktops, the application servers, and the database, and they're all in isolated single tenants for each customer. As I mentioned, the Automation Anywhere and UiPath cloud offerings are completely different than this. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's very, very different. The only part of this diagram that is managed for you is the application server orchestration piece. You still need to buy, set up, and manage the robot virtual desktops or virtual machines somewhere else on your own. That could be your cloud provider, that could be on-premise, that's up to you. And I guess my graphic could probably use a footnote that around the database, UiPath and Automation Anywhere do host some level of database for you. Otherwise, the orchestrator couldn't store anything. But these would only hold logs for up to 30 days. So realistically, any enterprise is still going to need to set up their own database. Now, that is a very big difference in infrastructure requirements. If you haven't already kind of mapped that out in your head, let's visualize it. With Blue Prism, you need one application server for every roughly 100 Blue Prism digital workers. I probably wouldn't architect a single point of failure, so let's call it 2 application servers for 100 digital workers or 3 application servers for 200 digital workers. The hardware infrastructure requirements for what's necessary to run a single digital worker, software robot, is fairly similar to the infrastructure required to host a single application server. So if you have 200 software robots, digital workers, that's roughly 203 fairly similar pieces of infrastructure required for your setup, plus the database server. With Blue Prism Cloud, all 203 of those infrastructure components or those virtual machines, those are hosted for you. In the exact same setup with Automation Anywhere or UiPath, they're only hosting 3 of those virtual machines, and you're left to source, manage, set up, handle all 200 additional virtual machines. It's a really big difference again. Now, I'm not saying that the UiPath Automation Anywhere hosted orchestrator model is bad. There's obviously going to be a huge difference in the price per license when you compare a solution where all the infrastructure and the platform management is included versus one where you need to source and manage almost all of that separately. Also, a licensed server has been one of the most requested features in Blue Prism for a really long time, and the cloud orchestrator approach would address that. Now, my objective in this video is not to sell you on the approach of one RPA vendor versus another. Let's face it, roadmaps can change on a day-to-day basis. However, I do want to make sure that you're informed enough to better translate what each vendor is marketing when they use phrases like no hardware, no infrastructure cost, and zero footprint. Each vendor apparently has a very different definition of what those phrases mean. Okay, so enough about what each RPA vendor is selling, and let's get into how the two architectural setups impact your platform performance and solution design. The biggest factor here comes down to how the various different parts of the RPA platform need to communicate. RPA software robots need to interact with target business applications, typically through the same user interfaces as a human uses. The robot is constantly reading and writing with these systems, and the speed of that interaction is clearly going to impact the overall performance of your business processes. Keep in mind, as a human, if you've dialed into a slow, laggy system, you've used a VPN to jump in there, and your responsiveness with that system is slow, well, software robots are kind of mimicking that same user experience. Now, there's no magic to this side of the equation. The location of your software robot compared to your target business application, or more importantly, the network speed between those two systems, is going to matter and impact your process performance. So let's say that you've set up an electronic medical record system in your data center in California, and your software robots are hosted in a data center or cloud provider out in India. For the software robot to perform work, it's going to send a communication or a command across the globe, bouncing through nodes along the way to the electronic medical record system in California. Then it needs to wait for a response from that system to bounce back across the globe. It's clearly going to impact your performance. In an ideal scenario, we would move the RPA software robot physically, in many times, closer to the target applications they're interacting with, ideally within the same data center to close that turnaround. However, with the increasing trend for software as a service solutions and applications that are accessible anywhere in the world via web browser, the geography of these components is becoming less of a concern. There are inevitably going to be applications in data centers you can control, but many, many more that are hosted somewhere else outside of your control. Okay, so that was the first round trip, but the second round trip is a little more complicated. The RPA software robot also needs to communicate with all the back-end orchestration layer components. This round trip includes information such as the process instructions, the logs, the credentials, and sometimes it includes images if you're doing OCR work or maybe screenshot exception handling. There's generally much more information flowing through this pathway compared to the first round trip. And depending on factors like your logging level, the software robots can get extremely chatty. And as I see day in and day out, this is where good solution design becomes critical. If there is an erratic response between the software robot and the target business application you're trying to automate, well, you can get into your process design and give a little bit more focus to intelligent wait times, retry loops, and exception handling. If there's an erratic response between the software robot and the orchestration layer, you have a lot fewer options. You can, of course, limit logging, so there's not so much chattiness going across the network. But outside of that, most of your options start to involve your infrastructure team. Now, in a perfect scenario, I would have both these round trips as fast as possible. But we can't always architect for that. So if I was forced to prioritize one of these round trips, in general, I'd want to prioritize the communication between the software robot and the orchestration layer. The most straightforward way to do that is by getting all the RPA components over into one data center. This could be done by having all the components on premise, or more in the spirit of this video series, putting all the components out in your cloud provider. You could also do something like the Blue Prism Cloud approach, or similarly by using an RPA as a service provider. Okay, so let's get rid of the slides at this point. As I mentioned at the start of this video, which probably feels like 3 days ago at this point, robotics as a service is going to be the topic of the next and final video in this little 3-part mini-series. I know this video has been rather long, and hopefully you learned something new coming out of it. If nothing else, I hope that you're walking away with more information to be able to have more relevant conversations with your RPA vendor, your infrastructure team, and your cloud provider. Keep in mind that everything that I've mentioned from a recommendation point of view is without me knowing your specific scenario. These are general recommendations, rule of thumb if I don't know anything else about your setup, but depending on your target business applications, your infrastructure, your internal policies, some of those recommendations could change. So take that for what you will. Thanks for tuning in with me. Tune in next time for my chat with Johnny Ramondino around robotics as a service, and have a great second half of your week.